it's really centering the people impacted by the technology and ensuring that those people have some say in how the technology is designed and used. That's the basic concept. And there's really a series of methods. We've here grouped it into two. There's a series of system mapping methods that involve really trying to understand how a technology is deployed in a specific context, and the various decision points where people defer to a technology, say like a machine learning AI system, to improve decision making. But one method we're using is mapping the ways in which the technology is used in a specific social institution to really understand where those key decision points are, and thus where stakeholder input might be particularly important. Secondly, of course, we want to do this mapping to really try to understand who are the different stakeholders affected and what their interests are, and ensure that those stakeholders have an ability, in partnership with the researcher, in partnership with the designer, in partnership with all other stakeholders, able to influence these policy and design decisions. And that's where the second participatory process comes in, where these different stakeholders are engaged in this spirit of partnership to ensure that all groups are represented in these decisions. Over the summer sprint, as Todd noted, we did have a bit of a head start, both because it's built on work that a small group of us did last year with respect to the ethics and equity of prescribed fire. So we did have a little bit of a head start in terms of some of the basic concepts, but really what we were trying to do over this summer was build out a community of practice, build out a larger group of Party Rand graduate students and researchers at Rand to think through how one can best ensure that stakeholders' views are represented in design decisions. And so that was kind of honestly a main goal, was just build out a community. And you'll hear from a number of the people and you'll see a list of everyone on the team shortly. But we do have a sort of a growing team that each contribute different methodologies and experiences to really get at that overarching Eiex goal. We did submit an RIR proposal. We were unfortunately not successful, but we do have another grant application currently under consideration, so hopeful for that. And the third thing, and this is really what's still ongoing and we're making lots of strides towards, is really refining the method. And that involves organizing literature, but really figuring out what are the next steps for moving forward and actually doing an Eiex like real life case study. So you see here a number of the folks on the team. You see it's a very large team, and that's intentional. And that it really is both to ensure that we bringing all these different disciplines, but also to try to build out a community of people that are interested in this, that might have other research projects where some of these ideas might be carried forward, and finding other pots of money to continue to fund the work and the like. So thanks to everybody on the team. It's been really exciting and gratifying for me personally to get to know a number of these folks and to work with them in this context. So we divided the team up into 4 different small groups, and each have a key part in the Eiex methodology. So there's folks that are looking at technology design and the traditional UI UX principles. There's folks that are experts in community participation and partnership, that really understand how to do stakeholder engagement, how we would actually inform stakeholders about different technologies and really get input from those stakeholders and how it ought to be used. As we've noted, there's a lot of system mapping and visualization techniques we're trying to bring to bear here that both tell the story of how the technology is designed, but also help provoke stakeholder engagement, and also just help illustrate some of the challenges, like where there's equity gaps, where there's people who are affected by a technology yet don't have voice or their interests aren't properly considered in some of the key decisions. And lastly, the technology application group looked at identifying a really specific area of tech application where we would try to leverage these other different methods. And that's what I was going to transition to, the first small group to look at these tech application areas. Now, Todd, we didn't talk about this in advance, but you were sort of spearheaded some of this development. So if you would like to speak to these slides, have at it, or I can carry it forward. Your choice.
Sure, I can step through them, but for other folks, definitely chime in if I miss something. So I haven't seen this version of the deck, so this is
Yeah.
this is my actually one of my favorite things in life. This is live theater and it's improv. So
There we go.
next slide. So we the group settled on, we had to sort of pick a horse to explore here. So the original idea was surveillance software that gets embedded into student capabilities and student software packages. And it's good to go that narrow, but we kind of then said, okay, well, let's actually take a bigger, more encompassing topic. And I have to go sign for a package. Can you pick it up, Ben? And I'll be back in a second.
Absolutely. No, my pleasure. Yeah. So, right. So thinking of some of the first principles. So yeah. So where we settled though was looking at this suite of software, sometimes known as ed tech, education tech, which was starting to develop pre-pandemic, but really took hold and became much more widespread and much more useful over the course of the pandemic when a number of schools moved to remote learning. And in that context, there was this rush to integrate various technologies to facilitate the remote education experience. And these are some of the principles that underlie some of this transition to further use of education technology, certainly trying to advance learning of students, making it easier for teachers and administrators to run classrooms and schools. And also, this technology also has these other potential applications like identifying serious problems with students. And these include situations where students might not be paying attention, where they might be plagiarizing, or where they might be conducting behavior that is indicative of perhaps some disciplinary issues or perhaps mental health issues such as suicidal ideation and the like. Todd, I see you're back. If you want to, you want to pick it up from here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I'll go to the next slide. Yep.
So as we look at this, we tried to dig into a couple of things. One is there are a lot of stakeholders in this, and it goes far beyond just the relationship between the teacher and the student. So it expands out to the school administration, then to the school districts, and then even up to, we mapped all the way up to state and federal, because if the software is involved in assessing and tracking a student, these are all of the various stakeholders that have some sort of interest in the performance of the students, and then potentially tracking what the students are doing and what they're thinking, which is a whole other Orwellian problem. And then we also recognize that there are different functionalities in these software packages. So, and they range from templates that help teachers prepare lesson plans, to doing real-time testing, to maintaining records over the history of students' performance, and then increasingly these surveillance capabilities that are tracking student actions for a variety of reasons. Next slide. So this is a rough prototype at, okay, if we've got a group of stakeholders and we've got a group of capabilities, can we start to map out the landscape to understand what are the relationships between the stakeholders and the capabilities that are being presented? So, like I said, this is a rough prototype to say, okay, at RAND we do matrices because that's the way we like to frame things. So can we build a matrix out of our stakeholders and our capabilities that these softwares provide? And then the key at the bottom is that we recognize that there are different, a student's relationship to a capability will be different than a teacher's relationship to a capability, which will be different than a parent's relationship with a capability, which will be different from law enforcement's relationship. So the idea here is to start to map the space and start to see patterns. You start to see sort of who owns what, who has access to what, and who's being targeted by certain things. And even though this is not a particularly deep dive, you can begin to see that the software companies maybe have an outsized amount of control over what's going on with these capabilities that are being used by the various stakeholders. Next slide. So this is an attempt to dig a little bit deeper in. So I think the power of this method is if you lay out all the stakeholders and you lay out all the capabilities and you start to see that matrix, you now can take an individual software capability and then do a deeper dive into that. So we wanted to focus on surveillance. So then it becomes a technical question. Technically, when you're surveilling, what are you doing? And so you have, you're using the keyboard, you're using the mouse/trackpad, and you're using the camera to assess what the student is doing when they're doing it. And then you try and back into perhaps why the student is doing it. So this is a what, how, why analysis, and anyone who took Tech and Society will recognize the what, how, why prompt. This is what, how, why analysis on technical capabilities, technical features within the surveillance realm. And the why on this is why that capability was implemented by the software company. And then by extension, then what that capability can be used for. And I think if the last 20 years have taught us anything, it is that the more data that you collect on people, the more things you can do with that data, especially when you start to combine it with other data sources. So when you consider that these software packages oftentimes are capturing every single keystroke, every single mouse click, and they are recording visually, they're digging a camera feed of the student and the student's environment. That's an incredible amount of data that has the potential to be mined for a variety of reasons. Next slide. So I think Tricia, is Tricia on? I can't see the whole list of folks.
I am on. I came in a little late. Apologies.
Yeah. Do you want to quickly talk to this slide?
Sure, I would be happy to. So what we have here, one of the things that we're thinking about are the types of questions we might need to answer for this sort of work. So in terms of design decision-making in two areas, the decision-making process with tech companies. So what's happening within the tech company as it creates the software, markets it, evaluates it, and potentially revises or amends it. And then decision-making processes within school districts as they consider adoption and implementation of the software, and then iteration with the tech companies for how that might be used, what kind of outcomes they're getting for it. So some of the questions we thought about for within tech companies for consideration, are they soliciting inputs from stakeholders? Which stakeholders, where in their process or when do they solicit that information, and how they solicit it and how it might be used? Which considerations are prioritized? So are they more interested in hearing from, say, school districts or boards, the ones that make final decisions about adoption? How involved are teachers, for example, or even student or parent voices? And again, who makes those decisions for prioritization of input? Is there transparency in the design of these technologies and how they're going to be used? And how is the technology marketed to users? So is there a different kind of marketing narrative for uses? Whether a user is sort of the target of it as a student, or are they being surveilled? Is there information being collected? But also the same with teachers, right? So whether teachers have a kind of different narrative that's pitched to them. When we look within school districts, some of the questions that we're thinking about in terms of whether inputs are solicited, what is the decision-making process within the school district? So is it what level of governance is there? Principals, higher level coordinators across the school district, sometimes state officials, boards of education for reviewing, adopting, implementing, and evaluating the technology. Same sort of questions related to priorities, whose inputs are prioritized and how. Is there transparency in the decision making? And is there any internal promotion and incentives for adoption?
Cool. Next slide. So when you start to think about the considerations, I think the previous sets of analyses shows that there are you can look at this at a lot of different parts of the stakeholder groups, and it goes from local, local meaning local within the classroom, to beyond the classroom, to beyond the individual school, and to beyond the individual school district. And a lot of the factors that you would expect to be problematic around privacy, security, and bias that creeps in are things that need to be considered as you start to work through this. Next slide. So this is a little bit of an oddball, perhaps, way of doing things, but since it's a tech and narrative lab, what is interesting, we think, is as you start to think about these stakeholders, there's the technology, and then there's the narratives around the technologies, and there's the narratives around the processes. And we broke this up into, there are narratives that are being created for those target audiences. So it's basically, what is the advertising? How are you selling this to students? How are you selling this to teachers and administrators? And then there's the narratives that those groups are creative. And these narratives that are listed tend towards dystopian, just because that's where we tend to go a lot of times with tech. But there could also be some other narratives, more positive narratives, that this does create some better outcomes, or it does save some time for some of the stakeholders. But so this is just, we think that you've got to do the analysis on the software and the stakeholder groups, but you also have to think deeply about the narratives that are involved, because at the end of the day, there are stories being told, and that's how people achieve their understanding of the topic. Next slide, and I think we're probably close to, yeah.
Yep, we're done here with this subgroup. So we'll now turn to the tech design subgroup, and I believe Michelle is briefing these.
Yeah, I'm going to present on behalf of this group, which included Jonathan Lamb, who I think is on this call, and he can chime in. I might call on you also a little bit. And then Jessica Arana, who is a designer from OEA, and we were really excited to have her input as well. So one of the first things that we talked about when we were thinking about kind of the traditional tech design community of practice and UX UI design is that it really focuses on users, and kind of thinking about user-centered design as a term that is often referred to in these design communities. And we really wanted to reorient away from just specifically thinking about kind of the main user of a piece of technology, and expand that to think about who has standing when we're talking about the ethics and equity of technology. Who are we impacting, and how do we operationalize those impacts? So we want to shift from the context of the use of the technology to the context of the impact of the technology. And we can kind of think about the internal context, where there are groups of individuals who are kind of directly impacted by a certain technology. So that might be, the traditional end users that you would think about. and then other decision makers related to that, the use of that technology or facilitating the use of it. And then there's more of an external context, which might include individuals who aren't able to access that technology, or maybe there are some more longitudinal, like societal shifts created by that technology that are affecting other groups that might not traditionally be considered in like UX UI design, for example. And go to the next slide. So from there, we started to think about some different categories of impact, and we sort of grouped these into two buckets. And Jonathan, feel free to chime in on any of these. But just to quickly go through them, thinking about availability and various barriers to accessing technologies. Related to that, what are the differential costs? So for example, if there's something that costs $9.99 as a subscription membership, that might mean something different in the budget of someone based on their socioeconomic class. And then similarly, if there's a technology that, for example, is for online learning that requires a high-speed internet connection to work effectively, well, that's not built into the technology, but it does have something to do with the performance. And so there's this like ancillary infrastructure impact there. And then in the other group, we have, just side effects of the technology, unexpected uses, emergent misuses, or as I mentioned previously, some of these more kind of long-term longitudinal effects of a technology, information asymmetries, which has a lot to do also with privacy and data ownership. Do groups that are interacting with the technology realize how they're being surveilled, for example, or what it really means to quote unquote agree to the terms of service of a particular technology? And then additionally, kind of thinking about network effects and kind of the skills that are often built around using a certain type of technology. So I think we can all relate to, if we're used to having all of our video chats on Teams and then we suddenly use Zoom, we don't know where any of the features are, thinking about those types of impacts that are maybe often overlooked in the traditional technology design process. Jonathan, did you have anything to add here?
Not really. I think that some nuance or some examples that might help illustrate a couple of those, especially the last bullet points that we talked about as examples with information asymmetries and data ownership, and a lot of that driving and thinking about how much people are kind of aware of the transparency they have and how things are being used, or kind of the differences in understanding of the technology between users and the providers of that technology or the creators of that technology. So understanding how things are being used and why they're being used. Some language that might relate to this is kind of the idea of informed consent around what you're giving away and having like knowledge about that and in an informed way. And the attachment and network effects, we sort of half jokingly talked about almost an inverse of planned obsolescence around some technologies where you have like this planned reliance or dependency, and all of these kind of creating potentially different sources of leverage that could intentionally or unintentionally exploit users in different ways.
Yeah, definitely. Next slide. So I think you'll start to see, as we go through these four groups, we're looking at Eiex as a method and kind of a concept from four different lenses, but there's a lot of overlap, and I think you'll see repeated themes. And as we'll talk about at the end, our next step from the work of these four small groups is to bring it all together into some really clear recommendations that are guided by each of these different areas and everyone's various areas of expertise to create some recommendations for what the Eiex method will look like. So in these analytical frameworks that we're drawing on here, you'll see some overlap on the participation side. We have participatory community-based research listed in here, and the community participation group that's presenting later. We'll talk a lot more about that, but that was something that came up in our group. Could you go back, Ben? And then inclusive design was a big topic that came up, and a lot of what we have been thinking about in this group in terms of recommendations for Eiex has really been based in the theories around inclusive design, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. But that is really a kind of growing community of practice that I think we can draw on pretty extensively for the Eiex method. And then on the right side, we have listed just some other analytical frameworks related to technology. And I'm going to go in a little bit more detail in a later slide about a particular framework from media ecology that we think is particularly useful. But Jonathan, I don't know if you wanted to quickly talk through these other analytical frameworks listed here under technology ecosystems.
Sure, yeah, and this is sort of just a bucket of things that have potential application, or kind of aspects of them could be useful in kind of creating a toolbox for thinking about how technology relates to other technologies in wherever it's being deployed, and the effects that it might have, and interacting with those dependencies it creates, or kind of the cascade effects that might kind of unfold from its introduction. So a lot of these are really trying to understand how can you add or kind of help the discovery of who has standing, because there might be actors or people affected by it that are not immediately obvious. And so how can you go out to kind of map the technology ecosystem that you're working in to maybe discover people that might be affected and how they might be affected in some way around that. So I think we imagine pulling together sort of a synthesis across these from these techniques to help designers kind of think through that in what would inherently have to be a fairly a very iterative kind of process. So, for example, actor network theory is, I think, an interesting thing to draw from that is this idea of being able to map out both the people and artifacts and systems and technologies in terms of their relationships with each other, and kind of making sense of an environment in that way, because there may be ways that say if you trace through a system and you say that there's an input to this piece of software, uses some data that's generated from some other kind of process, and then who's feeding that and who's being impacted by that. Mapping things out in that way could be a really useful exercise, and just kind of getting a shape of the system that you're working in. Nature of technology. This is a reference to Brian Arthur, who is a complexity researcher who has done a lot of extensive work on talking about the application of a kind of a biological evolution metaphor to technology, kind of understanding how systems and assemblies of technologies work together. And Herbert Simon talks a lot about the kind of recursive quality of the impact of technology on an environment, and how that might affect behavior and then subsequently affect future kinds of technologies. So kind of weaving those ideas together is to look at, if you have like a actor network or something like that describing an environment, and then maybe drawing from some inspiration from these other lines of thought around, well, how might that change and why might it not change, the resistance to that. And then technology and foresight, speculative design, like these are different areas that might also have some other things to offer in ways of kind of thinking about the future and possible futures, and drawing narratives from some of these exercises to understand some implications that, again, might not be immediately obvious. Because in a way, a lot of these exercises would have to be, in a sense, at least a lightweight foresight exercise. So I'll leave it with that. Michelle, if any other comments on that?
No, that's great.
Okay.
Next slide. So I wanted to just share a little bit of some of the key points from inclusive design, and there's kind of three top line principles that kind of kept coming up frequently in our discussion here. So the first one is about recognizing diversity and uniqueness. I think a lot of traditional technology design tries to find one solution that works for everyone, and I think, or that works for like the majority of people. And I think this concept of thinking at the margins, thinking about custom needs for different types of groups is really useful. And then the second point is about inclusive process and tools, and this really relates to the community participation group as well, but thinking about how the design of technology is created and kind of building in diverse perspectives and community partnership throughout that process is one of these key principles of inclusive design. And you might have heard this phrase, nothing about us without us. And I think that both the inclusive design community and also the community partnership community have a lot of existing frameworks that Eiex can use to build this kind of inclusive process. And then the third point is about thinking about a broader beneficial impact. And I think this is something really fundamental to Eiex, where, traditionally a lot of most, if not all, technology design has really been built with a sort of capitalist mindset and what's going to make the most money or get the most users and that type of thing. And I think as soon as we start reflecting on, especially some of these like applications of technology in education, you can start to see how we would want to have a broader set of goals and really thinking about the societal and beneficial impacts. And I think that really helps build in the idea of thinking about equity as a key kind of driver of the decision making when it comes to technology design. And just thinking about the broader impact, as we discussed previously in this group's portion of the presentation, to think about the larger context beyond even just maybe the traditional end users of a piece of technology. So next slide. And this is just one example of a framework from the technology ecosystems analytical frameworks that we thought was particularly useful and something that we could kind of directly pull into the Eiex methodology, this kind of tetrad of media effects where you're reflecting on these 4 prompts. And maybe Jonathan, I'll ask you to go through these 4 prompts if you don't mind and just explain what each one is.
Sure, yeah. And this was something that had been developing originally thinking about different types of media technology specifically, but it's something that really could be extended to almost any kind of artifact or technology. And there's more behind this, but basically as prompts, this first question, well, maybe with the second one, kind of a natural starting point to say, what does this extend or enhance or amplify? So it's if there's a pre-existing technology of some kind or an activity or a motive, what is the thing they're actually trying to do more of through this technology. But then at the same time, when you think about what is it obsolesce, that might be directly its precursors, but it might also, as a side effect, be other things that no longer really are useful or necessary with the rollout of this media or technology. With the idea of retrieval is something that's slightly more abstract, but it's thinking about what is this recall, or what's maybe something that's an outmoded or an older idea or kind of an original motivation that might be reflected in this technology. So something like Skype or social media, some of these things might kind of recall the idea, retrieve this idea of kind of a gathering around kind of in a more intimate sort of environment and recreating that idea or practice in a digital space. But then what does it reverse into? The idea with this is when something's kind of pushed to the extreme or rolled out or kind of oversaturated in some way, there's often a tendency that we see for there to be sort of a countercurrent or backlash or resistance to something as it becomes more dominant. Something we discussed the example of getting kind of saturated with like lots of screens and electronics and kind of bulky things that get kind of oppressive at a point where we want to sort of fold those in and make them more transparent. And with this movement towards maybe augmented reality and worn devices and trends towards more kind of natural materials and things that feel less overtly kind of oppressively technological, so to speak. So this is something that's interesting to kind of put one thing kind of in the center of this, and then potentially kind of trace this backwards through a whole network of technologies that kind of interrelated to each other. And it can be an interesting way of kind of pulling up things that may have been maybe considered before or become more obvious if you can kind of trace back to something that was retrieved or something that this technology extends, to reflect on its impacts in a way in a much simpler context. With emerging media, a lot of kind of social media technologies, or things that seem really fringy right now, if you unpack it kind of in more primitive terms, it might become more revealing, I guess, about some of the implications they might have, or at least stimulate some thinking around that in a way that's more familiar.
Yeah, and I think that's really related to a lot of the technology foresight, speculative design type of thinking as well. Thanks, Jonathan. So let's go to the next slide. So this is just an example and certainly not exhaustive, but I wanted to show a little bit of how we were thinking about kind of the sort of traditional technology design process or the current technology design process with these gray rectangles, and then where we might add Eiex into that technology design process. So things like expanding the groups that are involved or the context that we're thinking about in terms of the research for designing a technology, creating an advisory board as a technology, the specifications are being created for it. Explicitly stating transparency, I think, is a big aspect of equity, and thinking about, you know, as we are uncovering some of these potential impacts, if we can't mitigate all of them with the actual design of the technology, just explicitly stating concerns, and then on the monitoring side, actually monitoring for intended or unintended consequences and keeping track of how the technology is being used. So we are, you know, this is definitely a work in progress, and we'll be thinking about this as we kind of coalesce all of the insights from the various teams. And on the next slide, which is the last one for this group, we did some thinking just about the adoption of Eiex and how it would fit in with how technology is currently designed and implemented and adopted, and kind of had this discussion about, is this something that we want to try to add to a process with minimal disruption, or is this really a revolution in thinking that all of the actors and decision makers in, you know, the adoption, creation and adoption of a technology might really shift their thinking to consider these sorts of, you know, ethics and equity issues. And that's an ongoing discussion, I think, among all four of the small groups, among the whole sprint team here. We also talked about incentives and how they align for different types of actors in this sort of system that we're thinking about of technology design. And then along with that, where are the leverage points to potentially help with the adoption of Eiex? So that's it for our group. And I think we'll move to the community participation group with Jay.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And just to give you guys all a sense of who did this, this was myself, Ben, and Cynthia. We were sort of tasked with, Cynthia Gonzalez, who hasn't been, I guess, introduced to the meeting yet. But we were sort of tasked with thinking about community participation as what aspects of community participation we can bring into this framework and this ideal set and methodology. And I guess next slide, Ben, please. The first thing I want to do is ask all of us to sort of shift our thinking a little bit, and rather than thinking just about community participation, to think a little bit more deeply about community partnership. And I'll go into what that means now. Next slide, please. So the first step of community partnership, and as was mentioned by Michelle earlier, there's a lot of existing frameworks. This isn't a new sort of ideal set. There's a lot in the literature and a lot in the world for us to tap and draw upon, which I've started to do here by linking to, in these slides, the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene's community engagement framework is a place to sort of start to think about what this means and how we can incorporate it into work. I didn't do that because it's anything, it's a framework that's particularly notable or a framework that's particularly seminal. In fact, I did it for the opposite reason. This is a fairly typical example of the ways that community partnership can be incorporated into work, and chose it for that reason, to show what is really out there and what is really well established in the literature and in practice. So the steps to doing so, or some of the early steps to doing so, revolve around identifying community and context. Those are really key to establishing true community partnership. One of the main aspects of that is going to be defining community generally. And we've already started to do some of this work. I'll go into the ways that we've already started to do it and point that out in a moment. And we've already seen a lot of this. But something that we might want to consider doing in the future, and I push us toward doing, a best practice is allowing community to sort of define itself. This can be important for a number of reasons, but one of them is fundamentally recognizing that we're outsiders in a lot of these communities and a lot of these processes. And the insiders, the people who live this every day, are going to know more about it than we do. And that includes defining community itself. There's a lot of work that I've done in the past that I'll sort of skip over examples of in the interest of time, but in which our definitions of community that we came into the project's beginnings with as researchers were proven wrong by the project itself when we allowed community to define itself. We also need to identify the problem, question, or intervention. A lot of the communities that will be engaging are really dependent on the actual topic that we're discussing, or the ways that the reasons with which, or for the reasons under which we're engaging with them. Clear identification of those things is really fundamental toward building effective and reasonably just and equitable partnerships. We also need to identify the stakeholders that are affected and who's most affected. We did this a little bit in some of the work that was mentioned last summer about the equity and implications of prescribed fire in California. We identified a variety of stakeholders, but we also identified who were stakeholders that were most directly affected, who were stakeholders that were perhaps more indirectly affected, and how much voice and sort of amplification in the policy discussion space did each of those actors have. And we were able to sort of point toward folks who were very directly affected but not engaged in the process, and people who were less directly affected and had very loud voices in the process. Obvious ways to steer your work and your engagement strategies based on using that sort of knowledge. Furthermore, we also have to identify other efforts and existing networks or partnerships that might be engaged in the same problem already. We might be approaching a problem, a tool set, an intervention, and we might not be the first to do it. It doesn't necessarily mean that our partnership doesn't have anything to add to that space or to addressing that problem or to deploying effective tools. It just means that we need to be cognizant of the fact that many communities might find themselves in an over-researched state and experience fatigue because we're not the first group of people to come in and say we want to solve a problem and we have a bunch of questions to ask them. It's important to situate our work and our positionality in the long threads of ongoing efforts that probably might exist. We need to investigate and make sure that we know what they are and what's our place in those timelines. And also, finally, you need to build and maintain partnerships with some of those stakeholders we've identified. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Ben, and I'll talk about sort of the ways that we can start doing that, ways we've already started to do that. So bringing some context from our project into this, we've already started to identify some of these stakeholders, some of these communities, students, teachers, administrators, all the way down to some more geographic depictions of community. But it might still be important. I think it is still important. It's definitely still important to go to these folks and ask them to define their communities on their own terms. We've defined students here in terms of, say, pre-K, K through 6, these sort of age stratified, grade stratified methods of splitting up subcommunities of students. That might not be the way that students think of themselves and the ways that they see their own participation in their circles. They might have splits that are much more along maybe classroom lines or along participation in extracurricular activity lines or something along, in that world. Neighborhood's another good example. People often use neighborhood as a geographic description of community, but those boundaries get very fuzzy around the edges. I live in Northeast LA, and where Eagle Rock ends and Highland Park begins is something that the city has a line for, but the people in this neighborhood might deeply disagree about or contradict a lot. So allowing these folks to determine those communities on their own, or identify those communities on their own terms, is going to be very important for us to make sure that we're incorporating the people who most need to be partnered with. We've also already started to identify some of the the intervention question. What are we actually talking about here? What are we partnering for? Conversation. We've started to talk about the classes of education, software, and functionality. But what problems are these truly meant to solve and address, and what's been done in the past to address those? We want to be cognizant of the fact that, not cognizant of the fact, we want to avoid presenting solutions looking for problems and situate our work, like I said, in the long timeline of research and intervention that might have already been happening in these spaces to address these problems. Go to the next slide, Ben, please. All right, now what I was talking about before about the differences between sort of community participation and community partnership and pushing us toward what on this graph is the more right-hand side of the spectrum, there's varying levels of engagement, and they range from passive and distant, sort of the outreach side of this, all the way up to active and engaged, which is much more fundamentally about sharing power and sharing decision-making. And true community engagement and partnership involves pushing the work and the organization of the team all the way to the right-hand side of that graph. We've already started to talk about things like outreach and consultation. I think in Michelle's slides there was a place, an arrow drawn for intervention for something along community advisory boards, I think was the term used, and that's great. That's something that firmly lives in one of, I think, the left-hand, the two left-hand sides of that spectrum there. What I'm talking about when I talk about shared leadership and true partnership involves something that is admittedly a lot messier. It's going to involve ceding power, ceding decision-making to the folks that we've started to, that we've identified in community as relevant stakeholders and as the folks that need to be partnered with for achieving equitable and just outcomes here. And that means that they might steer the ship in ways that we don't anticipate it going, that we don't want it to go, and that even other stakeholders don't necessarily see it going. That messiness is part of the process. It's going to make the work more difficult. It's something to recognize, but it's an important part of this. Next slide, please. And finally, there's a number of sort of umbrella core values and concepts to keep in mind that are inherent to doing good community engaged and community partnered work. We've already started to talk about a lot of these words, things like equity, justice, accountability, transparency, sustainability. Those are all words that we've brought up, and they need to be present throughout the, all of the work that we're doing. But there are some more that I haven't heard brought up that I'd like to make sure that we say out loud and that we incorporate into the Eiex frameworks as we're sort of building them out. And those include power and inclusion. This power being a big one. Sharing true decision-making and true power is a big part of community partnership rather than just community, eliciting community input or something like that. And then capacity building, ensuring that once we leave, once the project ends, once the intervention might start to wrap up, that we haven't just pulled the rug out from underneath folks, and that solutions are enduring and that they truly address the problems even after we leave. Go ahead and go to the next slide. I think that's my end, but context. Sorry, I already mentioned the ways we've already started to bring some of this up. You can go ahead and move on to the next slide. Thank you.
Thanks, Jay. And recognizing that we are very quickly running out of time for any sort of discussion, I'm going to just briefly present the last small group. And this included Andrada Tomaya-Cotizel and Sam Allen, who are RAND researchers, and then Jeanette Sui, who's a student. And to just quickly actually go to the next slide, Ben, to just quickly say that this group really focused on the systems thinking and systems dynamic kind of field of practice, and thinking about the methods and tools from that area of practice, and really looking at how those can be used to identify stakeholders, understand their experiences, synthesize those perspectives, and then a key part of that is then visualizing what's found with those methods. So some of the key methods that we think are really useful from this field are causal loop diagrams, stock and flow diagrams, policy structure diagrams, and then actually taking some of those diagrams and doing real simulations to kind of do some of this forward-looking forecasting work with those models. And there are tools that support those mapping methods, including purposive text analysis and rigorously interpreted quotation analysis. And these are explicit frameworks and tools that have like grammars for the mapping, for example, and really specific best practices for how to apply these tools that we can adapt for the Eiex method. So if you go to the next slide, you can see, oh, and actually click a few more times, Ben. Great, thank you. You can see here, this is talking about resolving diverse perspectives, which I think has a lot to do with how we're engaging these different groups and some methods for, bringing those perspectives together and then having a way forward from, groups that might have different perspectives. And if you go to the next slide. So why is this important for Eiex? As I mentioned, these types of diagrams and methods can identify the cause and effect of things that might otherwise be missed. So a lot of what systems thinking and systems dynamics looks at is feedback loops. And the example graphic that you see on this page, I won't go into too much detail, but where there's a dotted arrow, that's an example of a positive feedback loop that we might want to include that without using this type of method might otherwise be missed. And I think having these types of visualizations and diagrams really helps for the communication between stakeholder groups and to decision makers to say, hey, we told you this narrative. We had maybe an anecdote about what's happening with this particular piece of technology. Maybe we showed you some data about it. We have some numbers. And here you can visually see, if we all understand what each kind of node on this graphic represents, then we can say, hey, the thing that we need to include in this technology system is this dotted arrow. That's the missing thing that can really help everyone understand what we're talking about a little bit better. And if you go to the next slide, Ben, some recommendations that came out of this group. Again, using the visualizations, developing something like a causal loop diagram specifically for the EdTech example. And then we were also thinking about potentially writing a white paper to disseminate these ideas and kind of circulating that in the systems thinking community and getting some feedback there. So Ben, actually, if you go to the next slide and then the following slide that has the next steps for this whole group, I think the goal of the summer sprint was really to build this community practice, move forward the thinking to say, okay, if we were going to really take an application like an EdTech application of technology and apply an Eiex method, well, what would that look like? What can we draw from these different fields of practice to make that method the best informed method possible? And so what we have left to do is take all of this information that we've very briefly summarized in this presentation and try to compile it over the next week as the sprint wraps up into some really cohesive recommendations for what the Eiex method looks like with references from all these different fields that we've been talking about. And then we'll have kind of a community, for one thing, that great big team that Ben presented at the beginning. And then we'll also have some materials that we could kind of shop around and promote inside of RAND as well as externally to say, hey, if you're doing something related to technology policy or technology design and development, here's how you can incorporate some thinking about ethics and equity into that. Anything to add, Ben?
No, that's tremendous. Yeah, and there is a lot of information here. Sorry, we didn't have time for conversation. We have a lot of conversation between the teams, and that's still very much ongoing. as you can probably imagine. So yeah, we're hoping to keep this going, and any suggestions you all have would be really great. We're all ears. Thanks.
Awesome, and apologies to folks for the fire hose, but it was there's a lot of stuff, and I think we'll have another conclave on Eiex, maybe late fall or something, which is once things have been distilled and we've percolated on some things, because it would be good. I think it would be really interesting to actually bring a couple questions to this group, or maybe we actually we do a mini case study in real time during the conclave on a technology. Maybe we do it on the technology that we would do Eiex on would be Teams meetings for collaboration. So we would do real-time analysis of what we're doing.
Or the metaverse world build. Again, it would be another potential example to go forward in.
Yep, awesome. Well, I know we're past time. Thanks everyone for showing up. If you've got questions, comments, feel free to email any of the folks on the team. And in 2 weeks, we'll have updates on some of the other sprints. So have a great rest of the Friday and have a great weekend. And thanks to everyone that worked on the Eiex stuff. We hope that this will have a life long beyond the sprint.